On April the 4th, 1731, the following extraordinary account was recorded in the city of Verona. The Countess Cornelia de Bandi was all day as well as she used to be, but at night was observed, when at supper, to be dull and heavy. She retired, was put to bed, where she passed 3 hours and more in familiar chat with her maid and in some prayers, at last falling asleep, and the door was shut. In the morning, the maid, taking notice that her mistress did not wake at the usual hour, went into the bedchamber and called her, but not being answered, feared some accident, opened the window, and saw the corpse of her mistress in this deplorable condition. 4 feet distant from the bed there was a heap of ashes, 2 legs untouched from the foot to the knee, their stockings still on. Between them was the lady's head, whose brains, half of the back part of the skull, and the whole chin were burnt to ashes, amongst which were found 3 fingers blackened. All the rest was ashes, which had a particular quality that they left in the hand when taken up, a greasy and stinking moisture. Spontaneous human combustion is a well-documented phenomenon in which a human body ignites and burns without any known contact with an external source of fire. In some cases the damage is slight, in others the victim is reduced to ashes, and in some of the strangest cases nearby objects escape relatively unscathed. The chair or bed on which the victim was sitting or lying, and even the clothes on the charred body, may be undamaged or only slightly singed. Often, too, a single foot, a leg, or the tips of some fingers remain intact, although the rest of the body is consumed. Cases of spontaneous human combustion began to appear in medical reports as far back as the 17th century, and by the 20th century the literature abounded in detailed accounts of inexplicable human incineration. Over a span of 4 centuries, more than 200 such incidents have been reported. In earlier times, the classical targets of this fiery fate were believed to be alcoholic and usually corpulent elderly women who lived alone. They almost always incinerated indoors on winter nights and were usually found near an open fire. Needless to say, there were no witnesses. Their deaths were attributed to God's punishment of their sins. But even in those days, there were exceptions. In fact, recent research into this strange phenomenon shows a fairly equal representation of the sexes among the victims, with ages ranging from infancy to 114 years, and many were abstemious and thin. Some have combusted in the proximity of a source of fire, but others have ignited while they were driving, or simply walking in surroundings devoid of any external source of fire. Contemporary scientific and medical opinion rejects the idea of spontaneous combustion, dismissing the many instances of inexplicable deaths by burning as simply puzzling or unsolved. Although a number of theories have been proposed, there is no sound physiological model that can explain how a human body could possibly self-ignite, or how it could burn fiercely enough to be reduced to ashes. Such consumption of human tissue and bone is only possible at the extreme temperatures of over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, provided by a pressurized crematorium. And, of course, when it comes to explaining unscorched clothing, or a fully fleshed limb associated with the ashy or charred remains, the inexplicable becomes the bizarre. Here are some of the strangest cases of spontaneous human combustion. Jean Millet was an innkeeper in Reims, France. On the night of the 17th of February, 1725, the inn was full of people in anticipation of a big fair the next day. Millet and his wife, Nicole, retired early. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, Millet awoke with a start. He smelled fire and rushed downstairs, banging on doors along the way to wake up any sleeping guests. When the panic group arrived in the big kitchen, what they found burning was not the inn, but the innkeeper's wife, Madame Millet, who was lying close to the fireplace and was almost totally consumed by fire. Only a part of her head, her lower limbs, and a few vertebrae remained. A small section of the flooring under the body had been burned through, and the chair she usually sat on next to the fireplace was slightly scorched, but nothing else in the room was even touched by fire. Millet was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was tried, declared guilty, and condemned to death. However, expert testimony proved that this could not have been a normal fire, but was instead the visitation of God. Jean Millet's sentence was reversed, and he was released. Dr. B. H. Hartwell, a New England doctor of medicine, reported that a child beckoned to him for help on the road near Ayer, Massachusetts, on the 12th of May, 1890. Standing in a clearing in a wood was the crouched form of a woman, the child's mother, with flames blazing from her shoulders, abdomen, and legs. Hartwell saw no evidence that she had set herself on fire, and noticed that the ground was still wet from a recent rainfall. So far as he could tell, she seemed to have just burst into flames without any apparent cause. The doctor was able to put out the flames by throwing earth onto the woman's badly burned body. Some odd things happened in Binbrook, Lincolnshire, England, around the end of 1904. In December, the Reverend A. C. Custance said that objects were being hurled about and sometimes catching fire at the rectory. A month later, a Binbrook farmer walked into his kitchen and saw the servant girl busily sweeping, oblivious of the flames leaping from the back of her dress. He shouted to her and rushed to smother the flames, but she was badly burned. A most peculiar fire took the lives of Mr. and Mrs. John Kiley, a retired couple at Butlock's Heath, a village near Southampton, England. On the morning of February the 26th, 1905, neighbours heard a scratching sound issuing from the Kiley house, and on entering the house they found the interior in flames. Mr. Kiley was lying on the floor, totally consumed by fire. His wife was in an easy chair in the same room, also badly charred but recognisable. The police investigators noticed an overturned table and an oil lamp with its glass chimney smashed on the floor, but it was not clear how this lamp could have been the cause of such an intense fire. The easy chair on which Mrs. Kiley was found was not burned or even singed. The jury brought in a verdict of accidental death, but by what means we are not able to say. Margaret and Wilhelmina Dewar were two retired teachers living at Whitley Bay near Blyth in England. On the evening of the 22nd of March, 1908, Margaret Dewar ran to her neighbour's house in great distress and told them that she had found her sister burned to death. When the neighbours entered the Dewar house, they found the charred body of Wilhelmina lying on a bed. The sheets and the bed showed no signs of fire, nor for that matter did any other part of the house. A curious case of spontaneous combustion was reported from Antigua in the West Indies in August 1929. The woman involved was luckier than most victims of such fires. Her clothing would ignite without any apparent cause, but she was always unharmed. Her bedding too was affected. The sheets above and below her were frequently scorched when she woke up. Her story was corroborated by the neighbours, who had helped to replace her burned-up wardrobe. On a cold January morning in 1932, in Bladenboro, North Carolina, the cotton dress of Mrs. Charles Williamson suddenly flared into flames. She was not standing near any kind of fire, and her dress had not been in contact with cleaning fluid or any other flammable substance. Her husband and daughter tore off the flaming dress with their bare hands. Remarkably, not one of the three was even slightly burned. Soon after this, a pair of Mr. Williamson's pants hanging in a closet burst into flames. Then a bed caught fire, as did the curtains in an occupied room. Various articles in the house were found burning with a bluish, jet-like flame, but oddly enough, adjacent objects were never affected. There was no smoke or smell associated with the flames, which could not be extinguished. They just vanished after the attacked object was totally consumed. The sudden combustion of Mrs. Mary Carpenter, who perished while vacationing on a cabin cruiser off Norfolk, England, on July the 29th, 1938, took place in full view of her husband and children. She was engulfed in flames and reduced to a charred corpse in minutes. No one else was burned, and the boat was undamaged. "I suppose her clothes caught fire," the investigating officer said, "but I can't understand how it happened." One of the youngest victims of unexplained death by fire, 11th-month-old Peter Seaton of London, had been put to bed as usual one evening in January 1939. Soon after, a visitor, Harold Huckstep, heard screams of terror. Rushing upstairs to Peter's room, Mr. Huckstep opened the door to face an inferno of leaping flames that flung him back across the hall. There was no way he could rescue the baby. After the firemen had put out the blaze, a thorough investigation of the nursery revealed nothing that could have caused such a conflagration. What was especially remarkable was that despite the intensity of the fire, hardly any of the furniture was damaged. On December the 15th, 1949, the police reported a 53-year-old woman, Mrs. Ellen K. Coutras, dead from burns in her home in Manchester, New Hampshire. Her horribly disfigured body was discovered lying on the floor in an unscorched room. The fireplace had not been used, and no other source of fire could be found. The Associated Press release stated, "There was no other sign of fire, and although the woman must have been a human torch, the flames had not ignited the wooden structure of the frame house." The 1951 death of Mrs. Mary Reeser of St. Petersburg, Florida, who was found reduced to ashes in a practically undamaged apartment, was a landmark case of spontaneous combustion, because it was the first instance where every possible tool of modern scientific investigation was used to determine the cause of this mysterious phenomenon. Yet despite the efforts of the FBI, fire officials, arson experts, and pathologists, a year after the incident, the St. Petersburg police commented as follows: "Our investigation has turned up nothing that could be singled out as proving beyond a doubt what actually happened. The case is still open. We are still as far from establishing any logical cause for the death as we were when we first entered Mrs. Reeser's apartment." Mary Reeser was a 67-year-old widow who spent the evening of July the 1st, 1951, having dinner with her son and grandchildren. When she left, she told her son that she was going home to take a couple of sleeping tablets and go to bed. The last person to see Mrs. Reeser alive was her landlady, Mrs. Pansy Carpenter, who lived in another apartment in the building. Mrs. Carpenter saw Mrs. Reeser briefly at about 9 p.m. When Mrs. Carpenter woke up on the Monday morning, she noticed a faint odour of smoke, but she was not alarmed because she thought it was an overheating engine. At 8 a.m., a telegram arrived for Mrs. Reeser. Mrs. Carpenter signed the receipt and went to her tenant's apartment to bring her the telegram. The doorknob, when she placed her hand on it, was hot. Alarmed, she stepped back and shouted for help. Two painters working across the street ran over. One of them opened the door. As he entered, he felt a blast of hot air. Thinking of rescuing Mrs. Reeser, he frantically looked around, but he saw no signs of her. The bed was empty. There was some smoke, but the only fire was a small flame on a wooden beam over a partition separating the living room and the kitchenette. The firemen arrived, put out the small flame with a hand pump, and tore away part of the partition. When the Assistant Fire Chief, S.O. Griffith, began his inspection of the premises, he could not believe his eyes. In the middle of the floor there was a charred area, roughly 4 feet in diameter, inside which he found a number of blackened chair springs and the ghastly remains of a human body, consisting of a charred liver attached to a piece of spine, a shrunken skull, 1 foot still wearing a black satin slipper, and a small pile of ashes. The coroner arrived to examine the body and survey the apartment. Although deeply puzzled, he decided that the death was accidental and authorised the removal of remains. The scooped-up ashes, the tiny, shrunken head, and the slipper-encased foot were taken by ambulance to a local hospital. The ensuing investigation included police and fire officials as well as arson experts. The facts that confronted them seemed inexplicable considering the great heat necessary to account for Mrs. Reese's incinerated body. Little of the furniture, other than the chair and the end table next to it, was badly damaged, but the apartment had suffered some peculiar effects. The ceilings, draperies and walls, from a point exactly 4 feet above the floor, were coated with a smelly, oily soot. Below this 4-foot mark there was none. The wall paint adjacent to the chair was faintly browned, but the carpet where the chair had rested was not even burned through. A wall mirror 10 feet away had cracked, probably from heat. On a dressing table 12 feet away, 2 pink wax candles had puddled, but their wicks lay undamaged in their holders. Plastic electrical outlets above the 4-foot mark were melted, but the fuses were not blown and the current was on. The baseboard electrical outlets were undamaged. An electric clock plugged into one of the fused fixtures had stopped at precisely 4:20, but the same clock ran perfectly when plugged into one of the baseboard outlets. Newspapers nearby on a table and draperies and linens on the daybed close at hand, all flammable, were not damaged. And though the painters and Mrs. Carpenter had felt a wave of heat when they opened the door, no one had noted smoke or a burning odour, and there were no embers or flames in the ashes. Faced with such a mystery, the St. Petersburg authorities called in the FBI. Laboratory findings showed that Mrs. Reese's estimated weight of 175 pounds had been reduced to a total of less than 10 pounds, including the foot and the shrunken head. The final report concluded that no known chemical agents or other accelerants had been involved in starting the fire, and ended by stating that the case was unusual and improbable. Asked to investigate, Dr. Wilton M. Krogman, a physical anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and a world-renowned expert on the effects of fire on the human body, finally gave up trying to understand what had happened. Dr. Krogman said, "I regard it as the most amazing thing I've ever seen. As I review it, the short hairs on my neck bristle with vague fear. Were I living in the Middle Ages, I'd mutter something about black magic." Coming up next time, demonic possession.